Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the founders of the In Their 20s podcast. Landon W Campbell is a 2020 graduate of DePaul's College of Communication. While in college, Landon had 10 internships at companies like Motorola Solutions, the Chicago Tribune, and Cameo. During his time at DePaul, Landon also served as the vice president of the DePaul student body. He currently works for Motorola Solutions as a software product specialist, along as well as the marketing lead for the Black Venture Capital Consortium. Michael Holmes was a 2020 graduate of DePaul's Driehaus College of Business. Michael developed a strong interest in entrepreneurship back in high school when he created a successful fertilizer business. During his time at DePaul, Michael served as the finance chair of Phi Kappa Psi Illinois Zeta. He was the best host, business partner, and friend anyone could ever ask for. Michael passed away at the young age of 22 from a rare brain cancer called astrocytoma. The cancer was aggressive, and Michael lost his life fiercely battling his diagnosis after only 30 days. This was a commonly seen trait in Michael. He was a fighter. No matter the outcome, he gave everything his all. He may have lost his life to this incurable disease, but his legacy lives on. He will forever be remembered as a standout colleague, successful entrepreneur, and an unforgettable friend. Our goal in sharing his story is to touch the lives of young men and women to use their time on this earth and live it extraordinarily. Without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Landon.
Perfect. Carolyn, thank you so much for the introduction. Warm introduction too. Really appreciate that. Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Very excited for our time together during this seminar. I will say I want this to be as interactive as possible. So I will be asking questions during it, and feel free to answer any questions and answers in the chat, and we will discuss those. But yeah, let's get started then. Let me share my screen. Perfect. All right. Carolyn, can you see my screen, and can everybody else see my screen?
Perfect.
Awesome. Minimize that. All right. So again, thank you so much for joining our seminar today. Focus on In Their 20s. It's going to be focusing on what we learned from interviewing influential people during quarantine. For those that do not know, my name is Landon Campbell, as Carolyn mentioned, and I again am the host of the In Their 20s podcast. Hasn't even been a year since we developed the podcast, but we've done some really exciting things, during our time creating the show, and we're going to be going over all those today. Before we get started, I just wanted to spend some time to talk about my co-host a little bit, who did pass away on Tuesday, April 20th. Of course, Michael was more than a co-host. He was one of my best friends, former roommate. And if it wasn't for him, of course, there would be no In Their 20s podcast. So I miss him dearly. And as Carolyn mentioned, and as I have been really mentioning the past few weeks, I'm looking for ways to preserve his legacy. And that is really going to be keeping this podcast alive. So again, just wanted to pay my respects to Michael, and I wish he was here, but I know he's looking down on us. And for those that do not know, we have opened up a fundraiser for Michael. This is a special fundraising campaign. We're looking to develop a scholarship fund on his behalf. And this was just launched last week, and already we've raised over $16,000. So this is, again, a very special fundraising campaign, and we're going to be developing a scholarship fund. It's going to help take care of memorial expenses as well. So learn more about that fundraising campaign at donateformichael.com. Perfect. So our agenda today, we're going to begin with breaking down why we launched our podcast In Their 20s. Of course, Michael and I had already spoken about creating a podcast, but it was a big jump to actually create one. So we're going to really talk about why we decided to launch a podcast. And not only am I going to be talking about In Their 20s for the whole time, I really, by the end of this seminar, want each and every single person in this audience to be motivated enough to create their own podcast. So we're going to be breaking into how and why start your own podcast. And I'm going to be giving you my 6 steps to creating your own podcast. And then we're going to break down into some of the best advice that we've heard from some of the best people we've interviewed. Of course, through In Their 20s, we've interviewed some cool people like Beto O'Rourke, Tim Hardaway Sr., the most powerful woman in banking, Jason Kellichanis, some very, very influential and big names. So I have brought together some video clips from those interviews that we're going to be sharing. And then we're going to talk about the importance of networking. Of course, In Their 20s is a podcast, is a content company. We have an internship. But if I really think about what I've really gained from creating this podcast, I think the most important thing has been networking. I've had opportunities to meet so many different people, connect so many different people. We've had so many audience members that have reached out to the influential people that we've interviewed to try and get jobs or just have them in their network. So I am a firm believer that networking is probably one of the most important qualities you can have. So we're going to talk about the importance of networking for a little bit. And then we're going to close off with what is next for In Their 20s. It hasn't even been a year, as I mentioned earlier, but we do have some big plans to keep this podcast going. Some major guests that we're going to be interviewing soon. So we're going to talk about what's next for the podcast. Perfect. So I met Michael my freshman year at DePaul University. I just moved to Chicago from California. I was 2,000 miles away. I knew nobody in Chicago. And Michael and I ended up rushing the same fraternity, Phi Kappa Psi. That was a fraternity where Michael actually served as our youngest finance chair, brought our chapter out of $20,000 in debt. I mean, from the moment I met this guy, he was just one of the most hardworking, disciplined, motivated individuals I had ever met at 18 years old. And I just really, really was in awe with his entrepreneurial spirit. And I just knew, and this is going to sound crazy, but I knew that we were going to start something special one day. And just, I knew that from originally when we met in the fraternity. And we would end up being roommates for 2 years during our sophomore and junior years of college. We lived in 2 6-beds, one in Wrigleyville, one in Lincoln Park. The first one you can actually call a 10-bed because we knew the guys that lived above. It was the dirtiest place ever, disgusting. But again, this was our first year off campus. And we, of course, made a lot of memories there. Lincoln Park, we grew up a little bit, matured up, and it was a good time. But throughout college, starting freshman year, something that was really unique about our house, we all worked, while in school. We were firm believers in having internships. I know Harlan mentioned earlier during the introduction, I had 10 internships. All of my friends and roommates that lived in this house, we were working so hard, just motivated to, put ourselves through college and, help take care of our utilities, rent. And it just really felt good to take what we were learning in the classroom and put it, towards learning at these internships. And I'd say that that's also going to be a common theme of why we ended up creating In Their 20s. There was just so much advice and cool things that we were learning outside in the real world that we wanted to be able to bring to others at scale. So that's why we ended up creating In Their 20s. So of course we were friends turned roommates turned co-hosts. And I think most people have had a conversation like this. And I actually specifically remember a conversation back in 2018 with Michael and another one of our roommates. We were talking about whether or not we should create a podcast. I think everybody, one point or another, has had that talk with someone else or just, even as internally, should I have a podcast? Everybody sees that there are so many podcasts out there. Everybody has a podcast. So I really do remember in 2018, Michael and I and our friend Nick, we were contemplating whether or not we should start a podcast. The thing was, and the reason why we didn't start it in 2018, we had no idea what we would create a podcast on because, we had a lot of different interests. As a friend group, we were thinking sports or gambling or investing. We were thinking about some cool topics, but we never ended up creating that podcast. But I do think it is special thinking back at it now, a year later after creating In Their 20s, that we actually did have plans earlier to create a podcast. But now we almost had an actual problem, which really led us to creating In Their 20s, and, an actual reason. Those reasons were that we were approaching graduation during a global pandemic, which was nuts. We're all living this together. This is our reality, but, especially for early 20 somethings, graduating college, we're always, we've been used to that routine for 4 years. I've been in school for, over 17 years. We are really just graduating college now and we're really confused on what we need to be doing. And we just saw, Michael and I, we really noticed a trend of job loss. Everybody was sad, depressed. I mean, there was just so much uncertainty. Even though Michael and I were very fortunate to have job offers already lined up prior to the pandemic, really got out of control. We were still scared. In full transparency, we were scared. We had no idea what it would be like going into the workforce during a pandemic, because this was all so new to all of us. So that was really, what we were thinking about back in March when we were contemplating how we could help our peers. So these were the problems we were thinking about. And the solution that we came up with was creating a podcast where we interview influential people to talk about their 20s. So I mentioned earlier, we had all these internships while we were in college. We had created strong relationships with so many successful CEOs, mentors, bosses during our times at these companies that really would go on to change our lives. I mean, if you think about the importance of experience while you're young as well, you just got to be a sponge. I mean, you got to learn so much and take up all that information. So that's what we really did during these internships. So we were thinking, Michael and I, we were thinking, okay, how can we give that same experience to other people, other people who have maybe not had the same internships that we have, don't have access to mentors, and just have so many questions about overcoming adversity, dealing with uncertainty. How could we bring that to scale? So that's why we thought of a podcast. And since day one, we have really stuck with this mission that in order to become successful, you need to see success. So a lot of times we only hear stories about what Bill Gates is doing today, well, especially what Bill Gates is doing today, but I mean, what the Mark Zuckerbergs are doing today, or, what Elon's or Oprah's, we see all the cool things that they've been able to accomplish, but we don't always talk about their journeys, how they actually got to becoming super successful, changing the world, innovating technology. So we wanted to really focus on the struggles because like so many of these big people that are so super successful now, we have struggled currently. I mean, we are early in our 20s. We're really joining the workforce, graduating college during a pandemic. There's a whole lot of anxiety. There's a lot of struggle. So we were looking for ways to share stories that matter, share stories that can change people's life. Because, we really believe in storytelling. And something really cool that Michael and I had in common, we love biopics. Those that don't know what biopics are, those are the movie genres about other people. So, thinking about like the founder, the movie about the McDonald's founder, or the Jobs movie, or the Social Network. Michael and I love biopics and movies like that. So we just love success stories. We love talking to people about how they got from point A to point B. So this was just a clear hole-in-one idea. I mean, create a podcast where we interview people to talk about their 20s. So I do want to put everybody on the spot, and please light up the chat. I want to ask you guys, what is the best advice you have ever received from a mentor? And as those start to come in, Harolyn, if you could read some of those out, I'd love to discuss some of them. And again, mentors can be parents, friends, colleagues, teachers, advice that you got 20 years ago, advice that you got yesterday, advice that was not even personally given to you. Maybe you read it on a blog or saw something on Instagram. I just want to hear some of the best advice that you guys have received.
Okay, and I'll read them as they come in the chat.
Perfect.
I'm trying to think the best advice I ever received. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
I love that. I think that is a really, really strong one. You really need to be a risk taker in life. Even if there's something that like you don't know if you're going to be able to do well, or you maybe think you don't have the skills to, take care of this new responsibility. I think it's always helpful to just get out there and try it out. And that can be seen clearly through creating our podcast. Before creating a podcast, we weren't these big qualified audio guys, and yeah, sure, we listened to a lot of podcasts before creating in their 20s, but we weren't podcast experts. But you become an expert from doing something. So I think experience is the best teacher. Harolyn, I love that quote.
Somebody said, your life is your responsibility.
I love that. Self-accountability. That is super important. Someone just gave some great advice to me a few interviews ago. The most powerful angel investor, or one of the most powerful angel investors in the world, pretty much said that no one is going to stop you from doing what you have to do other than you. Of course, we all have situations that we have to deal with. A lot of us have people that we have to take care of. But if you really are motivated to do something, start a podcast, keep it going, go out for a new job, ask someone out on a date. Only person that's really going to stop you from doing that is you. So I love that quote as well.
Someone said, befriend the material, and they received that from their boss when they told them about studying for the LSAT.
Wow, I love that one. Whoever said that, do you mind maybe elaborating a little bit? I think that's a really unique quote.
Here, I can unmute you. Okay, you're unmuted.
Hi, I said that. So I worked for an attorney. I was babysitting for an attorney, and he told me to befriend the material when I told him about studying for the LSAT. And basically that means get comfortable, get acquainted, and because you spend hours and hours, it seems like you're staring at the same thing. So it could be boring and it could be tedious, but so that advice really helped me to keep going.
I love that. Befriend the material. Love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Were there any others in the chat, Carolyn?
Someone said, always be curious.
Always be curious. I love that. No, I think you can always be a student. I don't care how successful you are. I don't care how long, you've been doing something. You should always be motivated to be a student of the game. Learn from different people. There's so many opportunities to continue to advance your intellectual knowledge. And I think you should always be a student. So I love that.
And then finding out what you don't like is just as important as finding out what you do. You can learn from everything.
I love that. I love that so much. Who shared that one?
That one was Sophie.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. Yeah. I love that quote a lot. That's really powerful. Perfect. So, that is all some great advice. And clearly, I was touched by hearing a lot of those, and it's just really powerful to hear, different advice that people have received. And that's why I just every single day, I'm so lucky to be working on such an interesting project, because everybody we've interviewed has a different outlook of life. They have a different background. They have a different journey. At heart, I want to be a storyteller. I am a storyteller, and it's just really powerful sharing different stories. So loved hearing all your guys' advice. Thank you so much. And why podcasts again? So you guys see how excited I am about podcasts. I'm a huge believer in podcasts. I'm a huge believer in audio. I think that there are not so many mediums out there as intimate as podcasting, where you have the audience's undivided attention for 30 minutes to an hour to 2 hours sometimes. I listened to a 2-hour podcast today. There aren't many mediums like that. And I understand, you got movies and you got music, but podcasting is great because I can work out while listening to a podcast. I can enjoy a podcast on my morning commute. I can enjoy a podcast while I'm doing homework or while I'm at work. I literally think podcasts are an innovative way and arguably the best way to learn, to teach, and to grow, to learn something new. So many people have different outlooks, so much information out there. Listen to a podcast for an hour. I guarantee if it's something about, if it's about something that you don't know, you're going to learn something. To teach as well. I am fortunate again to have In Their 20s because I get to teach people something new every single week. It's so much fun. And I think as a host, which again, I want a lot of you guys to develop podcasts after this. As a host, it's very gratifying. And of course, to grow. When I say grow, I also mean to build your brand. I think whether you are a guest on a podcast or you have a podcast like myself, I've been able to grow my brand so much in the past year. I've been able to network with people that I originally, could have never imagined speaking with or having a conversation with. So I really, really think it's a great way to learn, teach, and to grow. And also, I think the statistic is super interesting because not only do I believe in podcasting because I think it's amazing, obviously there are a lot of people out there that think it's amazing. 41% of the total US population over the age of 12 consider themselves monthly podcast listeners. So obviously this number is from 2021. It's really grown since the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of people think it's going to decrease, after things get a little more back to normal. But I really believe that once you're exposed to something that can change your life, it's really hard to imagine life without it. So I think so many people have seen the power of podcasting and audio, mainly from those three things I mentioned, learning, growing, and teaching. So many people have been exposed to podcasting that they're never going to be able to go back. So I don't think podcasting is going anywhere. I think more people are going to create podcasts. If I have one of you guys from this seminar afterwards say to yourself, I want to create a podcast, I'm doing my job. So I think more people are going to want to create podcasts. More people are going to want to be guests on podcasts. We're just going to have more podcasts and continue to see that in the future. So now I want to break off into our next agenda item: why create a podcast or be a guest on a podcast. So these are my 4 reasons why I think you should be on a podcast or create your own podcast. Number 1, build your brand within your industry. So let's say you are studying for the LSAT and you're looking to become a lawyer. If you are, interested or studying a specific type of law, I think it would be great for you to create a podcast where you share interviews with influential lawyers or people or other students taking the LSAT to share their experiences of how they've done well on the LSAT or scored well. I think no matter what industry you're in, you can really develop a strong name for yourself within that industry by creating a podcast. Because again, you're going to have that audience's undivided attention. They're going to care. They're going to want to listen to you. And your reputation is going to follow you wherever you go throughout your entire career. I think there's good and bad parts as being known as the podcasting guy. But I mean, when people think about what I've done so far professionally, they can think about all the cool people that I've interviewed, the stories that Michael and I have told. Of course, we've been fortunate to be featured in a lot of press releases and, a lot of people just really love our interviews. So I think no matter where you're at, there's so much power to build your brand, by having a podcast. Connect with audiences that care. I know I just mentioned this a little bit, and I am very redundant with this because I really believe in it. Podcasting, your audience really is going to tune in weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, however often you release episodes. They're tuning in to hear you and whatever you have to bring. So in a world where there are so many distractions, Instagram, each photo probably only gets average of like 2 to 3 seconds of someone's attention. YouTube, I'm going from video to video. I'm distracted because I have this going on, that going on. When I'm listening to a podcast, I really want to tune in. My ears, I'm listening, my senses, I'm really focused on what that person is saying, what their guests are saying. So this is a great way to connect with audiences that care and want to listen to you. Gain exposure and followers. I think this is also really important. It is connected to the whole idea of building your brand. I think this is a great way to connect with people, but then also gain exposure. Be known as that industry expert, whether or not you are a host or a guest. I think this is a really important way to do that as well. And talk about things you love. I think this is probably the most important. Each week I get to talk about the things that I love: personal development, entrepreneurship, success stories. Like I'm living the dream right now within their 20s. And it's so much fun. Doesn't have to be about, what I love though. You can be creating a podcast about coffee. If you are a coffee enthusiast and you try each and every cafe across the city of Chicago and you want to review it after, that could be a fun idea. Or sports. If you want to get very specific, you can just have a podcast about the Cubs and they just traded this person or drafted that person. You can have a podcast about that, or just about your philosophies as a human being. Whatever you want to talk about, you can talk about it. And it's that simple through podcasting. Now I'm going to talk about my 6 steps to starting a podcast. And before I dive into this, Carolyn, I just want to open up the chat. Are there any questions so far about anything that has been mentioned about in their 20s? Nothing's off limits. My recipe for joining a podcast or creating a podcast. Are there any questions in the chat?
No questions so far. I'll give it 1 minute and see if anyone has anything.
Perfect. I'll take another break in a little bit.
Okay.
6 steps, but these are my and Michael's. These were our personal 6 steps to starting a podcast. When we reflect, because Michael and I, we'd meet pretty much daily and also weekly to discuss our numbers, how we were doing, how many listeners we were getting, ideas for people we should interview. This was a business to us, and it doesn't have to be like that for everybody that wants to start a podcast, but in their 20s is and will always be a business first. So this is our personal recipe, like what we've learned to creating a podcast that features weekly guests. So each podcast, again, is going to be different, but this is what has worked for us. First off, you want to identify your passion. Easiest way to think about this is, what is something that you could talk about for an hour uninterrupted? What is something that you're passionate about? Or also, as well as talk about, what is something you can listen to for hours? So what is something that just really interests you? Is it sports? Is it health policy? Is it motorcycles? Anything. What is something that interests you? What interests me are other people's stories. And that's why, I really consider that a passion, and I could listen to someone else talk for an hour, and I do that through the podcast. So it's so much fun every single week to hear different stories. Never gets boring because, again, every single person has a different story. So I also want to mention, though, with this first step, thinking about passions, you don't want to overwhelm yourself. So you don't want to have a podcast that is trying to take too many subjects at one time. You can have multiple passions, that's fine. And maybe you find a unique way to intertwine them, and that's what makes your podcast unique. But again, this is my personal recipe, and I think that I personally wouldn't have a podcast focused on sports, poetry, fashion, unless it makes sense. So really think about your passions and what you could talk about for an extended period of time. Number 2, you need to develop a plan and also a name. So why will your show be unique? You need to really think about the perspective of the audience. Why are they going to want to stream your episode or your content on a daily, weekly, monthly basis? You need to be very intentional with that. I know it might sound like a super good idea to you, which is good. That's what it needs to be first, but you also need to be respectful of your audience. If you're talking about something very niche that maybe other people aren't going to be super enthusiastic about, you just need to think about that. And then also name. This is just a personal thing. I think your podcast name is probably one of the most important things. There's so many podcasts out there. You need to understand, or at least the audience should understand, what they will get from this podcast, by their name. So podcasts I listen to, like This Week in Startups by Jason Kellichanis. I know that I'm going to listen to this for an hour and a half a day and hear all the startup news in America. I know the Joe Rogan Experience, that's just his name, but people know about Joe Rogan's brand. So, you're going to get something like that by listening to that show. So there are so many clever title names that you can have. And we decided In Their 20s because, again, it's a podcast for people in their 20s. And that's as simple as it gets. Pinpoint guests. So not every podcast is forced to have guests. Of course, we have guests on every podcast. I recommend having guests because industry experts add so much value to our shows and to each episode. So yeah, Michael and I, we could go and create an episode about our personal experiences, and that's something that we have done, and we haven't had any guests on. But I always prefer to have guests on. And no matter what type of show you have, I think this is a great idea. And it is so easy to find guests through your personal networks we started, with people in our networks. We had ideas of like different industries that we want to interview people from, but we really sat down and thought about, okay, who do we know? Who has inspired us? A professor, a doctor that we know, or someone, a friend. I mean, who has inspired us and who would inspire other people? So we started there, pinpointed specific guests, and we went on from there. But I think guests, again, adds so much value to podcasts. And number 4, I love this one. I think someone earlier had a quote that's pretty much going to represent what I'm about to say, but I think number 4 is just all about getting out and doing it. You can brainstorm all you want. You can have a conversation like I did with Michael in 2018 saying we should do this and not end up doing it. But I think like you just get started and the rest will kind of figure itself out. So of course, be strategic, have a plan, but just record and edit your first episode. It's that simple. I think with all episodes, you want to have an intro that really captivates the audience and like gives them a preview of what they're going to be listening to or be exposed to for the next 30 minutes to an hour or however long your show is. And of course, you want to listen to your episode before sharing it. Just review it once, edit, if there are any coughs or sirens or any sounds in the background. It's always nice to review it. I mean, you don't turn in a paper for a professor without reviewing it at least a few times, hopefully more than once. So I think that's super important. Number 5. So as I mentioned, in their 20s, we, of course, audio focused, but we're across all platforms. So which means we have to design social assets and covers for all of our episodes, which are all really easy to create. You can create a logo, cover art, everything on canva.com. Super simple, easy to create designs. It's literally a Photoshop that is very simple, and a lot of people enjoy using it. So I think, you need to be really intentional with your front cover of the actual show, but then also for every episode as well. And then, of course, share across platforms. I have an Instagram page, a personal page. I have a LinkedIn, a Twitter. I always cross promote on different platforms to really expose new audiences and new people looking for a podcast to what I'm making each week. And I also encourage our guests to share as well to their networks. And that's also been a great way that we've been able to get new guests on. We'll have a guest and the episode is amazing. They'll share it. And now they have someone, a close colleague or someone that literally is a distant friend on their LinkedIn that sees it, understands our mission for In Their 20s, and they'll ask to be a guest. And we've gotten some really big people literally from that method. So I always think that just the time that you put into it, developing a plan, pinpointing guests, recording, editing, social assets, be proud of your work, share it, and inspire. Of course, want to discuss some early mistakes because I know everything sounded pretty cool so far, but with anything, you're gonna have some early mistakes that you need to really understand, what's happening early in order to find solutions. And I'd say a big mistake for us was just dealing with rejection. There were a lot of people that we were reaching out to that didn't want to come on In Their 20s for any reason in the world. Either because they said we didn't have enough episodes, they didn't fully understand what we were doing, and like the theme of our podcast. They were busy, and that's something that we really just fought through. And I think that this is not just for podcasting. Me having 10 internships, cool and all, but like I also like applied to over 500 places and like rejection. You need to be okay with rejection and be really just thoughtful about, your mission and your path. So we really kept pushing forward. And now I can confidently say that, of course, there are people that we still want to get on and like have no idea what we're doing within their 20s. Former presidents, like big influential people. But there are so many influential people that, we have been able to get on with no problem because they see what we've created. They've seen the high caliber guests that we've had on our show. Like soon, we're actually going to be interviewing. I don't want to spoil it yet, but it's the co-founder of a big social media platform that everybody uses on this seminar right now. So, I mean, we've interviewed some amazing people. We have some huge interviews lined up, but it's just cool to think about the past, beginning of the year where we just got so many rejections and we just kept pushing through. So I think that's super important. And another big thing, and I wouldn't necessarily call this like the biggest mistake, but it's just something we had to learn. We really needed to listen to our community at the beginning, and maybe we didn't do that enough. So what I mean by community is, we have these in their 20s, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram. We have people that tune in weekly for our interviews, and they will talk to us. They'll say, hey, I saw this interview. I loved it. I loved this piece of advice. And, that of course always makes me and Michael feel really good. But, there were so many times where they would be asking for, hey, can you interview like a first-gen college student, or can you interview someone in this industry, that industry? So that's something that we didn't do that much in the beginning because we were really trying to build this up. But now I think it's super important to really listen to your community, your audience, your customers. No matter what type of business you're doing, podcasting, listen to people who are listening to you. And by doing that, they're only going to be as more excited to share in their 20s and your podcast with their friends. So I'd say community and just like listening to feedback, constructive criticism is very important. And, after listening to feedback, after continuing to build, really pushing through the rejections, we've really been able to create something strong within their 20s. We've really, our focus since day one has been like business leaders, all-star athletes, and celebrities, but we've interviewed so many more industries, news anchors, fashion designers, restaurant owners. A lot of these industries I have like no correlation to, I know nothing about, but that's what makes them so fun. And, I like have learned so much through this. Our audience weekly learns so much through our interviews. And also something that's really interesting about a in their 20s interview, it doesn't matter like what industry professional we're speaking with. If it's a restaurant owner, doctor, poet, I really can confidently say that every interview that we've shared can be for everybody. And I think that's really cool to think about because, someone who is not interested like in the fashion industry, I think it's amazing, but, I don't work within fashion. I've learned so much from our fashion designers that we've had on because it's just really interesting to hear their stories and their journeys and how they push through uncertainty. So I just think like the theme of our podcast is just really that personal development, self-sufficiency, success. And it is a really beautiful thing to share these stories. So that's been a lot of fun. And of course, we've interviewed like big people from big companies as well. We've interviewed the editor-in-chief of the Tribune, a very high up woman at Microsoft, the most powerful woman in banking, Gary Vaynerchuk's brother, the most powerful angel investor in the world, as I mentioned earlier. So some really high profile companies, and a lot of these companies have shared our episodes with their employees, which has really helped our reach a lot. So that's been really powerful. And I mentioned, I believe it was number 5, designing social assets. I just wanted to expose all you guys to what our assets look like. These are maybe, I think like 30 or something of the covers that we have. And right now we're at 50 plus interviews, but my like main 3 rules for social media in general, and like, whenever I create social assets, I want consistency, I want simplicity, and I want shareability. And of course, we have an internship program too. So the interns are also focused on creating these. And those are the 3 pillars that I preach. Consistency. You can see that these are all like on brand to in their 20s. If someone saw this, they would understand, it's in their 20s. Our logo's there, same color, font. I mean, it's an in their 20s interview cover. And then, of course, I mentioned simplicity as well. You don't want to overwhelm people with the cover. There are so many podcasts out there. on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever your audience is enjoying their podcast. You really want to keep the cover simple. You want to keep the bio simple. So we've gone for just simple titles as well. How Jewel Burke sold her company to Amazon. How Kevin Bain built his restaurant empire. How Cathy Bassant became the most powerful woman in banking. There are some really fun titles here, but we all just focus on simplicity and shareability as well. I mentioned in step 6, it's super important to share your covers, motivate your guests to share them as well. So by creating these covers, we create them in a way where we have our guests front and center. Like we want them to share them. We want them to be motivated to share these, which they have. We usually have no problems with that. So that's been really good as well. But those are the 3 things that I think if there are any social media marketing people in the audience or people that just want to hear about my philosophy on social media, I think I always focus on simplicity, shareability, and consistency. That's super important. And that's been our plan since day one. We've been very fortunate, of course, to be featured in a lot of press pieces as well. And this has helped us grow, exponentially. And we've been able to, not just in the Chicago community, but also, across California to New York. I mean, our audience base is really big, even on a global level. Our past internship featured internships from 4 different countries, which was really special. And we're going to be having another internship available in the next few weeks as well. And of course, that's going to be on our website if anybody's interested in learning more about that internship. The InTheir20s Podcasting and Business Development internship is very fun. We do it with a company called Upkey. They're a Chicago-based company that is focused on helping students get experience. As Mr. 10 internships, I'm a big believer in internships. I think experience is the best teacher. And through our internship, we motivate our interns to create their own podcasts, to reach out to influential people, to edit content, to do, pretty much everything, not just with podcasting, but then also with business development. So I think it's a great program. It's a great 4-week program. Last winter, we took on 10 college interns, and in a few weeks, we're going to be opening up applications for 20. So I'm really excited for that. And again, all of these press pieces, have led to opportunities like having an internship program. So I think that's also really important as well. If you want to have a podcast and run it like a business, like we have and do, you have to be very intentional about reaching out to press, sharing with people who need to see it and can help spread the word about what you're doing as well. So that's been really important to us. Harlan, I'm going to take a few seconds and see if anybody has any questions in the audience about any of that.
We had one question come through, and Hannah wants to know, who was your first guest?
Our first guest was a man named Zoaib Mirza. He was one of my professors. He was my statistics professor in college, from Pakistan, first generation college student, moved to the US when he was very, very young, knew nobody. So I really related to that a lot. And I loved his class. He was just super nice. And I have still a strong relationship with him. So, when thinking about our first guest, it was that simple. Like, who in our life, Michael or I, has really inspired us, has great industry knowledge, and, who would be able to really contribute a lot to an interview. So I think we all have people like that in our lives that if you want to have a show, you could easily find people to guest star on that show. You just need to really be intentional about who you want to have on your show. And then vice versa as well. I think anybody can and should be a guest on a podcast. I think it's a great way, I mentioned those 4 things earlier, to build your brand, connect with audiences that care, talk about things you love. I think anybody can be a guest on a podcast. I try and be a guest whenever I have opportunities to. And I also am working on something on the side that we're going to discuss in a little bit to help more people get on podcasts. So I think both ways, it's easier than you think to find guests, and everybody should and can be a guest.
Okay. And Would you reach back out to people who have declined in the past?
It depends. I think that there have been a few opportunities where like we could do that. But I mean, I just think like, yeah, we haven't really been motivated to reach back out to a lot of people that turned us away. But there have been people who like haven't said no completely, but they have told us like reach back out in like crazy numbers, like 5 to 6 months. And we have literally like put it down on our calendar, reached out, and then we end up having the interview with them. And like those have been like some really big fish, like some really, really big people. So that has been led to great opportunities for us, patience, strategy. But just because like I am hard-headed and like we have received like early no's, like I think that I haven't really been motivated to reach back out to those people. But they for sure see what we're doing now. So feels good. Any other questions?
That was it for now.
Nice. Perfect. So again, like the mantra of In Their 20s, the best advice from the best people. We are pivoting onto the next segment of our seminar. And I wanted to share with you guys some people that we've spoken with through our podcast. And I also brought some video clips so we can also like hear their advice. So our first person is Cathy Bassant. She is the Chief Operations and Technology Officer at Bank of America. She has been called multiple years in a row by Forbes magazine and Barron's and a lot of publications the most powerful woman in banking. So that right there, like, just intrigues me as a storyteller. Like someone as powerful as Cathy Bassant, of course, like I'd want to know what she was doing in her 20s. And that is something that I think everybody would want to know if they want to be as successful as Cathy Bassant. So speaking with her was a really great time, and she shared some great advice, really focused on trust.
I think that people who are best as they move up through companies are people who are direct, who are honest and straightforward, who understand that bad news should never wait. Bad news does not get better with time. And that that whole notion of being authentic, not necessarily always being, out there, not necessarily always wearing a baseball cap, but being who you are and letting that come through will make you better at what you do, more comfortable in the various roles you will take on. And it is the most fundamental ingredient to building trust. And I will say this, people only promote people they trust. Every one of my 8 direct reports, I literally trust with my professional life every single day.
Love that. University of Michigan graduate, started from the bottom, literally, along with like all of our people. But Cathy Bassant was a great interview. Another person we spoke with was Tim Hardaway Sr., 5-time All-Star, Olympic gold medalist, played against Michael Jordan in his 20s, future Hall of Famer. He played for my Golden State Warriors. He was the king of the crossover. He was our point guard before Steph Curry. And like, he was just such a great interview and a lot of fun. And, again, like we focus on business leaders, all-star athletes, celebrities. I will say that like the athletes that we've interviewed, it's really nice because even though I'm not playing professional sports right now, I think like all advice that really can be related to sports can also be related to, a professional journey as well, through business, etc. So I think his advice was really interesting.
You all got to have the confidence to do what you all are doing right now. And, I'm quite sure it's some type of negativity from some people because they, as they call it, haters. People hate on people. But you have to, like my mom used to tell me, sticks and stones may break your bones, but names and words will never hurt you. And if you true to yourself and you understand yourself and understand that you can do and you believe in you, then you can take your career to another level.
Nowhere in that 40-second clip does he mention basketball, but I mean, you can clearly see that's just life advice. So, whether or not I am now a basketball player, a poet, a finance person, again, like all of our interviews, they're for everybody. And I really mean that.
You all
We spoke with Jewel Burks as well. She is the head of Google for startups in the United States. Jewel is really interesting. She sold her company to Amazon at 27 years old. It was a tech company, but she had no tech background. So while her clip doesn't really speak on this, I just wanted to point this out. Super interesting of her. She surrounded herself with people who were really smart with technology and could help her build her company. And I think that really speaks a lot about her leadership and something that I really tried to emulate. I am okay not being the best at everything. I want to hire people who are smarter, better than me. I think every person in a leadership position should want that. And that's something that we look for, within their 20s. It's something that the other things I'm doing, you should always look to surround yourself with people who can teach you something. And that goes back to, again, the importance of podcasting. You got to always be a student. You got to always be a student of the game, always be able to learn. But I just think that that's super interesting about Jewel.
For you, if you're in your 20s, just think about the future, think about where you want to be, and try to think about the steps that you can take to get there. I think thinking about things on 10-year horizons has helped me a lot. So I thought about where I wanted to be. When I was 20, I thought about where I wanted to be when I was 30. And I'm happy to say that most of the things that I was thinking about have actually come true because I was really intentional about visioning for the future. Right now, I think a lot about where I want to be when I'm 40. Like I mentioned, I don't plan on working I'm definitely not going to have 2 jobs when I'm 40. That's the plan. So I think a lot about things on 10-year horizons, and I think about working myself backward.
So as I mentioned earlier, like Michael and I, we discuss our numbers on a weekly basis. We understand, who's listening to our podcast, which country, age metrics. And on the subject of age, we've seen within the past few months that not only people in their 20s are listening to our interviews, we have so many teenage listeners that are wanting to prepare for their 20s and know what they need to do. We have so many people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that listen to our interviews because it's never too late to be inspired. So someone like Jewel who just shared some great advice about thinking about your life on a 10-year horizon, I think that can also be for anybody. We spoke with Beto O'Rourke. This was one of our first big interviews. Beto, for those that do not know, former congressman in Texas, ran against Ted Cruz for Senate, toying around with the idea for Texas governor. And he also ran for president in 2020. And of course, he's very close with Joe Biden. Went to Columbia University in New York. And this was a fun interview. We enjoyed it a lot. Afterwards, he invited us to his home in El Paso after the pandemic. But this was the advice that he shared.
I've seen so many people squander the opportunity to take risks and chances and to do something that may turn out to be dumb as shit, but you did it. You got it out of your system because they felt like they had to be on this track. They were on this track in high school. They were on this track in college. And by God, they're going to stay on this track and get ahead. And there's the risk of burnout, and there's the risk that you deny yourself this chance to try these things that you really won't get a chance to do later in life. So to long answer your question, Michael, Landon, the balance is much easier to strike if there is such a thing as balance when you are younger and a little freer. When you get to where I am in life, closing in on 50 years old, the options constrain, and that's just part of life. So, I mean, blow it out when you got the chance.
Perfect. We got 2 more for you. This is Saku Kaland, head of Northeast Banking at Consumer Banking. He created a program at JP Morgan Chase called Advancing Black Pathways. It was this huge program, $30 billion program funded by JP Morgan that he ran to help Black individuals, students, families learn about really, finances. So finance literacy, and just such a great guy. And he really spoke a lot about, networking during our interview with him.
When you meet somebody and you send a generic email, hi, it was great meeting you you at fill in the blank would love to stay in touch. Just think of how many other emails they got just like that. This person has no idea who you are because you didn't do anything that was differentiated. If you instead had a conversation with this person and you talked about how, you thought economic reform, whatever the subject was, then you insert something back to being authentic. Really enjoyed hearing your insight on how the second quarter GDP could shape up. I've fill in the blank. Okay, now I've anchored you at least on the conversation I've had, right? And so then you now created a way to connect that you don't just get the generic response, and that perhaps now that you can follow up because the person can identify who they were actually speaking to versus a generic, great to meet you out of the 200 people you met this evening.
Of course. And I think that we use that same mentality when it comes to the people we get on our shows and reaching out to guests. We don't look no longer for the generic messages like, hi, come on this podcast. All these big people have hundreds of people asking them to come on their podcast. So we try and be very intentional and specific with how we reach out now. If you're looking for a new job, I'd also recommend that, or networking, as Saku mentioned in that clip. Be very intentional with how you can stand out in that email. In our last quick video clip, Jason Kellichanis, I believe he's the most influential angel investor in the world. He was one of the first investors in Uber when so many people thought that was the worst idea ever. He turned $10,000 into $100 million from that deal. Super successful guy. And this was his advice.
Well, thanks for having me. What a great idea for a podcast, by the way. I wish this podcast existed when I was in my 20s. Most of the magic happens when you get to having done something hundreds of times. There's hundreds of investments, hundreds of podcasts, hundreds of blog posts. I really think repetition and sticking with stuff is another thing, and really pushing that rock up the hill. Hard work pays off. There's a lot of snowflakes and people want balance. That's all bullshit, to be candid. You can leave it out if you want, but it's utter nonsense. There's a direct correlation between how hard you work and how many hours you work and how successful you are. You're 23, you have 41 podcasts under your belt. You're going to get to 200 or 300 by the time you're 25. You do it once a week. Now you're walking into Sirius XM or Spotify. You're thinking about getting a job at those places, and they're like, "Yeah, I've done 200 podcasts," and they're like, "Okay, here's a big bag of cash and a bunch of responsibility because you did shit without having to be asked to do it."
I think repetition is very important, no matter what you're doing. If it's studying for the LSAT, or you're looking to create a podcast, or looking to learn a new hobby or skill, play the guitar. Repetition. That's what's going to get you from point A to Z, and that's how you can become an expert in something. And so, quick question that I wanted to ask, and we won't spend too much time on this because I see that we have hit the hour mark already. What was something that you learned during the pandemic? And maybe, Harlan, we can read off a few of these. But I've learned so much from these interviews. And I think you should always be in the interest of learning, be a student. I'd love to hear from you guys. What was something that you learned during the pandemic?
I'll let a few responses come in the chat. I'm trying to think. I learned so much during the pandemic. I mean, patience, how to adjust. I mean, that was a big one. Hector said how to be flexible, especially with working remotely and working where you're living.
I love that, Hector. That's a good one.
Hannah said how to be flexible. Yeah. So same thing, pretty much. Me too. I would second that, or third it. Definitely being flexible.
Love that. Yeah, no, I think flexibility, patience, adaptability, those are some of the big key things that we've learned during the pandemic. And if you want to, of course, learn some more things, tune into these interviews. And our last subject of the evening now will be a short one. It's just the importance of networking. This is a networking event. I encourage everybody to stay in contact with me after this. If you currently aren't, continue to watch these interviews, ask me any questions whenever. I think just networking is so important. And to break down why, number one, it's an avenue for new opportunities. Whether it's a new job or a new hobby that you're trying to learn, or, if you will one day create a podcast and you're going to be looking for guests. These are all opportunities that you can really have through networking. So that's really my first one, very important. It improves your creative intellect. I feel like, much smarter after speaking with very smart people. I think everybody does. It's really nice to be able to hear and learn something that you had no idea about, have no idea about. And now after listening to someone speak about that, you can go inspire someone else. So I think networking is very important for this reason too. It improves your creative intellect. Number 3, growth and self-confidence. I know Sekou mentioned you need to be unique about how you're reaching out to people, be intentional, how you speak with people. That can really help you build your self-confidence. Having these conversations with unique people, attending these seminars, events, looking to add new people on LinkedIn and asking if you can have a conversation with them, things that you might have been scared to do previously. You can really jump over that hurdle through networking. So I think number 3, growth and self-confidence. And I'd like to share this video. This is from one of our early interviews, 5th, with an entrepreneur that really shares her big reason for networking. Your network is your network. So you really need to surround yourself with people who can help change your life, motivate you.
That's my favorite. Yeah. But then you also never know. Like I said, you can't look at somebody and say, oh, they're the smartest kid in the class, and they're the, I'm going to make sure I'm friends with that person. It's the people you least expect. I'm telling you, and I'm telling you as a reflection of looking back 20 years ago. A lot of the people that I thought, oh, they're the class, they're the class star, they're the valedictorian, they're going to be the one that I need to know, they're going to be the millionaire of the future. It's not always those people. It's people that that often get overlooked, and those are the ones that have that fire in them, say, I'm going to prove everybody wrong. So I never imagined what the people that I knew from high school and college would do for my life, and I just didn't know that then. But imagine if I would have been a mean girl back then, or if I would have left a bad taste in their mouth. That carries over.
So why do I think this one's important? I love this quote because it really speaks on authenticity. You don't want to be fake when it comes to creating relationships with people, or I'm going to be reaching out to this influential person to have them in my network, just for no reason besides, it needs to be authentic. It needs to be real. You need to go to someone with a reason why you want to connect with them. So I think the proper word to use here is transactional. You don't want it to be transactional. You want it to be authentic. You want it to be real. So before you guys jump out there and look to network with other people, I think you should always need to look at how I can be as real as possible, as human. I really want to and need to care about what they're working on, and not even act interested, be interested in what they're working on. That's real networking. So I think that's also really important. Our last topic now, what's next for In Their 20s? A few things, I just really am, of course, saddened with Michael's death and passing, and, no one prepares you for losing your best friend. It's really crazy. It was very unexpected. But I just am so appreciative of what we've been able to build together, during a time where there's been so much uncertainty with COVID, and I was back home for the beginning of the pandemic, but also, here in Chicago, away from family for a lot of time. It's just been a crazy time, and working from home, trying to find that balance. And I've really had Michael by my side, for the past year. And we've just been really busy working on this idea. It was an idea that we were really passionate about, believed in, still believe in. And I want to keep it going to honor his legacy, and just, let him know forever, how much he meant to me as a friend. So I'm going to keep this podcast going, in his honor. I'm going to continue to love what I do because it's so much fun. But of course, every single day I'm going to continue to think about my friend and co-host. So we're going to keep it going. And on the side, as I mentioned earlier, I am working on this idea called Basil. And Basil is focused on helping people get on podcasts. So anybody in this room right now, I believe, can and should be on a podcast. So what we're doing with Basil, because we believe everyone has a story to tell, we connect podcast shows with guests, emerging guests. So if you have a show and you're looking for guests, we send you guests for free. And if you have the motivation to be a guest on a podcast because you want to build your brand, you want to connect with audiences that care, you want to talk about things that you love, you guys should all check out Basil. It's something, it's been a lot of fun for me recently because, again, I believe in this. I believe in audio. I believe in podcasting. I want to make it easier for shows to find guests because it can be challenging. And I also want to make it much easier for guests to get on podcast because if you haven't been on a podcast already, it's pretty difficult to find ways to get on a podcast. So we hand pick these connections between show and guest. That's something that no other service is out there offering. No algorithm. It's all human curation. So we can confidently say that we are connecting the best shows with the best guests. So again, if you want to learn more about that, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn, Basil Pod. And that's something that, again, if anybody wants to talk about afterwards, let me know. And because this is a networking event, I'd love to stay in touch with each and every single one of you guys. That's my Instagram right there, my LinkedIn, and my Twitter. Our website, you'll be able to find my email through the website, InTheir20s.com. If you have any questions in the future about anything that I mentioned during the seminar, a guest recommendation, interest in getting on Basil, if you want to hear from a specific person from an industry that we haven't really touched on the podcast, let me know. I am always reading DMs. I'm always reading emails. I'm always really happy to hear feedback or, just criticism. Also is really helpful. Or if there's something that people really enjoyed from an interview, a specific nugget of advice, it's always really special to hear our audience and community speak on that. So please, let's stay in touch. And I really thank each and every single one of you guys for attending our seminar today. Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Landon. That was amazing. Basil Pod sounds great.
Yes.
Just thank you and everybody for showing up today. And we really appreciate you still doing this in Michael's honor. And we'll keep his family, friends, and you and everyone in our prayers. And thanks again for today. And everyone has Landon's information. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to him. And thanks again for joining us today. Have a great rest of your evening, everybody.
You too. Thank you, Heroin.
All righty. Thank you.
All right.